Earl Jenkins never thought retirement would involve this much drama over dirt. Not the red kind, not the gossipy kind, just the regular, brown, God-made, wheat-growing kind that used to mean something. Most mornings, before the sun crested the line of sycamores that guarded the edge of his property, Earl sat on his porch with a chipped mug of coffee and listened to the soft, reliable rhythm of sprinklers ticking across his lawn. The scent of dew mixed with diesel. His old John Deere rested under the oak like a loyal dog waiting for orders. Out here on the edge of the subdivision, you could still hear crickets instead of leaf blowers, at least until 8 o'clock, when the neighborhood woke up and started trying to out-organize nature. He'd bought this little lakefront parcel 15 years back, before the developers carved it into Harvest Ridge Estates. Back then, nobody minded that he grew a few rows of wheat for fun. It reminded him of the Kansas farm where he grew up. Dust, sweat, and a sense that you'd earned your dinner. The HOA paperwork had come later, one thick envelope full of rules about community harmony, visual cohesion, and a paragraph defining approved ground cover. Earl had skimmed it, laughed, and gone back to sharpening the mower blades. The new neighbors didn't always get him. Most of them worked remote tech jobs, talked about HOA values, and ordered their mulch in bags that matched their patio furniture. Earl wasn't unfriendly. He waved, fixed a few mailboxes, even hauled a stranded minivan once. But he noticed the sideways glances whenever he drove the tractor down to the lake edge. To him, it was practical. To them, apparently, it was apocalyptic. Then there was Karen McDougal, HOA president, power-walking clipboard, sunglasses big enough to deflect criticism. She moved in 2 years ago and immediately modernized the HOA website, meaning she added a complaint form the neighbors could submit anonymously. Earl never checked it, but he could tell when someone had. That tight smile she wore at the mailbox told him as much as any email ever could. That June morning started like any other. The wheat shimmered gold in the early light, heavy with seed and ready for harvest. Earl ran a hand across the heads and felt the satisfying crackle of dryness. A few more days and he'd fire up the combine. But first he wanted to make sure the tractor's hydraulics were working smooth. He backed it out from under the oak, wiped a smear of oil from his knuckles, and let the engine idle, a low, throaty hum that blended with the buzz of cicadas. That's when he noticed her, Karen, standing across the cul-de-sac with her phone held at arm's length like a paparazzi at a tractor convention. She snapped a few pictures, turned, and typed furiously. Earl tipped his hat in greeting. She didn't wave back. Instead, she shouted across the street, "That thing's not allowed here." He cupped a hand around his ear. "You mean the tractor?" She marched closer, the kind of determined strut usually reserved for small claims court. "Yes, the machine. It violates our aesthetic code. Heavy equipment can't be visible from the street." Earl blinked. "Well, I guess I could put a blindfold on it, but then she won't see where she's going to." Karen didn't laugh. She never did. "You'll be receiving a notice. We have standards here." She spun on her heel and strode back to her driveway, where a gleaming white SUV waited, its bumper proudly displaying an HOA logo sticker. He figured that was the end of it. Folks get touchy about things they don't understand, he thought. Maybe she'd cool off after a yoga class. He went back to tightening a bolt, the engine purring steady. But that night, tucked among the grocery ads and seed catalogs, sat a crisp envelope stamped official notice. He read it twice to be sure he wasn't dreaming. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, your visible use of agricultural machinery constitutes a violation of Article 7, Section B of the Harvest Ridge Community Standards. Please remove or conceal the offending equipment within 72 hours to preserve neighborhood harmony." At the bottom, in a neat looping signature, was Karen McDougal, HOA president. Earl leaned back in his chair and let out a laugh that startled the cat. "Harmony," he said out loud. "Guess they never heard of crop rotation." He folded the letter neatly and set it on the counter. He wasn't angry yet, just puzzled. Like a man reading a weather forecast that predicted snow in July. He'd kept that tractor behind the oak tree for years. It wasn't an eyesore. It was practically yard art. The same neighbors who complained about it lined their porches with inflatable snowmen every winter. The next morning, his buddy Tom from 3 houses down stopped by for coffee. Tom had lived there longer than most and understood Earl's dry humor. "Heard the HOA's breathin' down your neck," he said, grinning. Earl nodded toward the letter on the table. "Apparently I'm disturbing the peace." Tom picked it up, whistled. "They write this like you're hosting illegal raves. What are you gonna do?" "Probably what I always do," Earl said. "Keep my head down and see what blows over." He meant it. He'd learned in the army that most storms pass if you don't panic. But the thought of having to hide his tractor on his own land, it stuck in his craw. He looked out the window at the wheat bending in the wind, at the sunlight glinting off the green hood of his deer, and felt that small spark of irritation flicker. 2 days later, the spark grew. Another envelope. Same elegant signature. This one warned of a $500 fine if the offending equipment wasn't removed. It even included a blurry color printout, Karen's photo from across the street, zoomed in like an alien sighting. Earl exhaled through his nose. He wasn't much for confrontation, but he wasn't built for surrender either. He walked outside, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stood by the tractor. The metal was warm from the sun. He could almost hear his late father's voice. A man's land is his handshake with the earth. He looked back at the letter. "Well, Dad," he murmured. "Seems like some folks don't shake hands no more. They file complaints." That evening, he parked the tractor right where it was most visible, half out of stubbornness, half out of principle. If the HOA wanted a show, they'd get a polite one. At dawn the next day, the familiar hum of his diesel filled the air again. A couple of early walkers glanced his way. Karen's blinds twitched. He could almost sense her fury radiating across the cul-de-sac. He smiled into his coffee. Morning, neighbors. The calm, the golden light, the rhythm of ordinary life. All of it felt slightly sharper now, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. He didn't know yet how ridiculous things were about to get. He only knew that letter had set something in motion that wouldn't stop until justice, and a bit of irony, had been served. That letter changed everything. 3 days after that first letter, Earl started noticing new kinds of traffic on his street. Not cars, not delivery vans, people with clipboards. They moved in pairs like surveyors, stopping in front of his property, whispering, then jotting notes. One even crouched near his mailbox to take a picture of his driveway angle. Earl waved, as any decent neighbor would. They didn't wave back. By noon, he'd counted 5 of them. They left the way all official people do. No words, just dust. The next morning, another envelope arrived. This one thicker. Inside was an invoice with a fine, $500, for non-compliance with community aesthetic regulation. There was even a color photograph of his tractor from an angle that made it look twice its size, as if he were storing a tank on his property. Beneath it was a quote from the HOA handbook. "Agricultural machinery visible from the road may be construed as disruptive to community unity." Earl read that line twice and muttered, "Unity must be allergic to horsepower." He set the paper down and took a long sip of coffee, thinking of all the absurd things he'd seen in life. Supply officers miscounting crates, generals blaming the weather, but this one was special. A tractor fine. He drove into town to run errands. When he returned, his neighbor Tom was waiting by the fence, grinning like a man watching a sitcom in real life. "Heard they're serious about that fine, Earl. You gonna pay it?" Earl shook his head. "I might frame it. Hang it in the shed." Tom chuckled. "Careful. They'll fine you for offensive wall art." By late afternoon, word had spread. A few of the older neighbors dropped by, pretending to ask about his mower but clearly curious about the scandal. One woman whispered, "Karen's telling folks your tractor attracts rodents." Another added, "She said it's a fire hazard near all that wheat." Earl sighed. "It's wheat, not dynamite." That night, he got a call from the HOA secretary, a nervous-sounding man named Dennis. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm just the messenger, but the board is requesting you move your vehicle behind the shed by Friday." "Dennis," Earl said calmly, "I'd need a crane to fit that tractor behind the shed. You folks planning to provide one?" Dennis hesitated. "Well, maybe you could cover it with a tarp. The regulation says, not visible from street." "I'll think about it," Earl replied, and hung up before he said what he was really thinking. By Thursday, Karen had escalated. She stood at the edge of her driveway during the morning dog-walking hour, chatting loudly with passers-by. "It's not about the tractor," she said, voice projecting. "It's about standards. Some of us work hard to keep this neighborhood looking presentable." Earl heard her through the open garage window. He glanced at his reflection in the tractor's polished fender. "Guess I should have waxed it twice." That afternoon, a new notice appeared taped to his mailbox. Same $500 fine, now with a threat of further disciplinary measures. At the bottom, Karen's neat signature looped like a decorative snake. He tried to stay amused. He even started narrating his days in his head like it was a TV episode. Day 4 of Tractorgate. Karen spotted near mailbox. Hostilities continue. Still, the absurdity wore on him. Each night, as the sun sank and the wheat glowed amber, he'd look out across his quiet land and feel the weight of pettiness pressing down. It wasn't the money, it was the principle. A man ought to be able to park his own tractor on his own soil. Saturday brought the final straw. Earl had just finished adjusting the grain chute when he heard a loud crunch. Metal on metal. He turned, slow and steady, to see Karen's pristine white SUV angled halfway into his tractor's fender. Her reverse lights were still on. She jumped out, red-faced and waving her phone. "You need to move that thing. It's blocking the road." "The road?" he said. "Ma'am, it's 20 feet from the pavement. You should have put up a cone or something. This is dangerous. I'm calling the cops." He stared, somewhere between disbelief and laughter. "You hit a parked tractor, Karen." She crossed her arms, defiant. "It shouldn't have been there." Within 10 minutes, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up. Earl recognized Deputy Hank Willis, a man he'd served with in the reserves 20 years ago. Hank stepped out, took one look at the scene, and sighed. "Afternoon, Earl." "Afternoon, ma'am. What seems to be the issue?" Karen launched into a breathless story about unsafe farm machinery and reckless property placement. Hank listened politely, nodding like a man waiting for a commercial break to end. Then he turned to Earl. "Tractor been parked here long?" 15 years, Earl said. "Didn't move till she hit it." Hank inspected the fender, then Karen's bumper, where green paint transferred like evidence in a crime drama. "Well," he said slowly, "looks like an accident on private property. No traffic violation. Insurance can handle it." Karen's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. He needs a citation." Hank shrugged. "For what? Having a tractor?" Earl fought the urge to smile. Karen sputtered, demanded his badge number, then climbed back into her SUV. The engine revved, but the right headlight flickered, damaged in the collision. She sped off anyway, leaving a faint trail of dust and indignation. Tom appeared minutes later, carrying 2 beers. "Heard the sirens. You all right?" Earl took one, popped the cap with his belt buckle. "I think I just survived a drive-by from a luxury vehicle." Tom laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. "Bet she's writing the next HOA newsletter already." Sure enough, on Monday, a new issue appeared in everyone's mailbox. The lead article, and signed but unmistakably written by Karen, was titled Safety and Standards: Why Machinery Has No Place in Residential Zones. It featured a cropped photo of the accident, carefully framed to show only the tractor fender, not the SUV's dent. The caption read, "Let's keep Harvest Ridge safe for everyone." Earl read it over breakfast, shaking his head. Safe from what? Wheat. He thought about letting it go. Let the storm blow over. But by mid-morning, his phone buzzed with another HOA message. This time, a notice of further investigation. Karen had apparently filed a formal complaint alleging property endangerment. That did it. Something in him settled, quiet, certain. He wasn't going to yell, wasn't going to make a scene. He'd learned long ago that silence unnerves petty people more than shouting ever could. He'd handle this the way he handled engine repairs. Slowly, methodically, with the right wrench. That night, he sat at his kitchen table under the dim yellow light, a pile of papers spread before him. The HOA handbook, meeting minutes, Amendments. He read every page like a detective. Somewhere in this mess of bureaucracy he'd find leverage. And when he did, he'd use it. Outside, the wheat swayed gently in the moonlight. The dented tractor sat still, dignified, like a soldier bearing a scar. Earl looked out the window and muttered, "You hang in there, girl. We're not done yet." He didn't know it yet, but this was the point of no return. The moment the quiet man drew his invisible line in the sand. From here on, it wouldn't be about fines or letters. It would be about principle, paperwork, and one very poetic kind of payback. He leaned back, a slow grin forming. "They think they know rules," he said softly. "Let's see how they like it when someone actually reads them." Outside, a sprinkler clicked to life, steady and rhythmic, marking time like a drum roll before the storm. The next morning began like most others. Coffee, the sound of sprinklers, the sun bleeding gold over the wheat. But something was different about Earl. He wasn't irritated anymore. He was focused, calm in that dangerous way only a man with a plan can be. The tractor, dented but still gleaming, sat proudly by the oak tree. Its fender caught the light like a badge of honor. Earl studied it for a while, then turned and walked back inside, letter in hand, ready to dig. The HOA handbook lay open on the table, pages bristling with sticky notes. The fine print was small enough to make a lawyer squint, but Earl had patience. He'd read worse: military contracts, insurance claims, even a few love letters from his late wife written in shorthand. Bureaucracy didn't scare him. It bored him. But today it was his battlefield. By the time the sun climbed high, he'd found something. Page 43, subsection C, under Community Landscape Improvements. It stated that any area visible from the main street or common property shall be considered a shared community aesthetic. The same clause Karen used to justify her fines could be flipped like a pancake. If his wheat field and tractor were part of the community aesthetic, then her bumper meeting his fender wasn't just an accident. It was damage to shared community property. Earl let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, setting the page aside. He wasn't a man who enjoyed revenge. But he did believe in fairness, and sometimes fairness came wrapped in irony. That evening, he walked down to the lake to clear his head. Fireflies shimmered along the bank. He could hear frogs croaking, the soft creak of porch swings, and the faint whine of Karen's SUV engine in the distance. He smiled. The night smelled like rain and justice waiting its turn. Back inside, he began his paperwork. He typed up a community damage report, using the HOA's own template, downloaded right from their site. He filled every box with quiet precision. Under description of incident, he wrote, "Vehicular damage caused by HOA president to visible community aesthetic, tractor and adjacent wheat crop." He attached photos of the dent, the torn stalks, and the SUV's green paint transfer. The next day, he mailed copies to the HOA board, the insurance company listed on their policy, and, just for fun, the county office that handled community property disputes. No exaggeration, no threats, just the facts. Earl's way of fighting back wasn't loud. It was meticulous. By the end of the week, word spread faster than mosquitoes at a picnic. Neighbors stopped pretending not to watch. Some even gave him quiet thumbs-ups when he passed by. A few, like Tom, couldn't help visiting for updates. "So let me get this straight," Tom said, sitting on the porch with a beer. "You filed a claim against the HOA because Karen hit your tractor?" Earl nodded. "Under their own landscaping rules. If they say it's community visible property, then she damaged community property." Tom laughed so hard he nearly choked. That's beautiful, man. That's art." Earl shrugged. "I'm just following the book they gave me." The following Monday, the HOA held a special review session. Earl wasn't invited, but he didn't need to be. Small towns have faster communication than email. Dennis, the nervous secretary, called him afterward. "Mr. Jenkins, the board is, reviewing your claim." "Reviewin' or panickin'?" Earl asked. Dennis hesitated. "A bit of both, sir." Earl chuckled. "That's fair." Over the next few days, small signs of chaos appeared. Karen's newsletter was delayed. Her usual morning patrols ceased. And on Wednesday, the HOA's Facebook page, normally full of recipes and lawn tips, locked comments after a post titled, "Respecting Our Community Boundaries," turned into a digital brawl. Someone even photoshopped Karen into a tractor ad. Earl tried not to grin when he saw it, but failed. He'd seen morale crumble in all sorts of situations. This was the civilian version. He kept busy with small tasks, fixing the porch railing, trimming the hedges, but his mind hummed with anticipation. He knew the board wouldn't take long to respond. Bureaucracies move slow, but self-preservation speeds them up. Late Thursday evening, a knock came at the door. It was Karen, clipboard clutched like a shield. Her face was tight, her smile thinner than a credit card. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her tone sugar over steel. "We received your report." Earl leaned on the doorframe. "That right?" Hope it was clear enough. "It's absurd," she snapped. "You can't claim community damage for your personal property." "Didn't say personal," he replied evenly. "Your bylaws call anything visible from the street part of the community aesthetic. That's your language, not mine." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're twisting the rules." "Ma'am," he said with a small smile. "I'm following him word for word. Thought you'd appreciate that." For a moment, she stood silent, probably weighing whether to argue or retreat. Finally, she huffed, "This isn't over." Earl tipped his hat. "Didn't think it was." When she left, he could hear the SUV's wounded headlight rattling as it turned the corner. He took a slow sip of coffee and muttered, "She's gonna dig her own hole if she keeps at it." By Friday morning, another letter arrived, this one not from Karen but from the HOA treasurer. It was short, formal, and oddly apologetic. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, we have received your claim and are currently reviewing the applicability of Section 4, subsection C, in relation to your property and its classification as community visible landscaping. We will provide an update within 10 business days." Earl folded the letter carefully, slid it into a drawer beside the first fine notice, and smiled. That's progress. The next few days were quiet, almost suspiciously so. Karen avoided him entirely, though her husband waved once. Awkwardly, like a man caught between two governments. The gossip train slowed, but the tension didn't. Earl could feel it in the air. Even the sprinklers seemed to hiss differently. He used the time to tidy the wheat field, trimming the edges and setting up a small sign that read under maintenance, HOA Beautification Zone. He'd printed it himself on bright white poster board, complete with the HOA logo copied straight from their website. When Tom saw it, he nearly doubled over. "You're poking the bear now. Just keeping the neighborhood informed," Earl said, deadpan. "Transparency's important." The following Monday, Earl received an email from the HOA's insurance provider acknowledging his claim. It included an itemized form asking for estimated repair costs and photos of the damage. He filled it out that night. Total estimate, $2,742. Tractor fender, crop repair, and repainting labor. He added a note. Payment may be directed to HOA maintenance budget as restitution for community property impact. When he sent it off, he felt a strange mix of amusement and peace. He wasn't doing this for vengeance anymore. It was about principle, about proving that calm logic beats petty control. And maybe, deep down, he enjoyed seeing how far common sense could stretch against nonsense. That night, he sat on the porch with Tom, both of them watching the fireflies blink over the wheat. "Think they'll pay?" Tom asked. "Oh, they'll pay," Earl said. "One way or another. Folks like that always do. Just not how they expect." Karen's house lights flicked off across the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was still, quiet, holding its breath again, the kind of silence that comes before a reckoning. Earl took another slow sip of coffee. They had no idea what was coming. By the time the next week rolled around, the neighborhood had turned into something between a soap opera and a small claims courtroom. People who'd never said more than nice weather to Earl were suddenly friendly. Too friendly. Some wanted details. Others just wanted to stand near the tractor like tourists at a monument. "That's the one?" they'd whisper, as if it were the Liberty Bell. Earl didn't mind. He kept to his routines. Coffee at 6, tractor maintenance at 8, quiet amusement all day. He'd seen storms before. Bureaucratic ones just took longer to rain. On Tuesday morning, he got the first real sign that the dam was cracking. Dennis from the HOA called, voice trembling through the receiver. Mr. Jenkins, there's, been some confusion regarding your claim. Earl smiled. Confusion's their specialty. Well, yes, but apparently the insurance company reached out directly to our treasurer. They're treating your incident as an active landscaping damage claim under the HOA policy. Sounds right to me, Earl said, completely calm. Dennis hesitated. Karen's not happy. I'd wager she isn't. That afternoon, flyers appeared on everyone's doorsteps announcing an emergency HOA session. Attendance required. Earl read his copy aloud to Tom, who was mid-sip of lemonade. Topic: clarification of community property boundaries. Tom snorted so hard it came out his nose. The meeting took place in the community center, a small beige building that smelled of burnt coffee and new carpet. Earl arrived early, mostly for the free donuts, and found Karen already there arranging papers at the head table. She looked composed but brittle like a ceramic teapot under pressure. Evening, Earl said politely. She didn't look up. You're here as an observer only. I'm just here for the harmony, he said, taking a seat in the back. The room filled fast. Dozens of neighbors, some curious, others clearly there for the drama. When the meeting started, Karen launched into a speech about preserving our community's visual integrity and misinterpretations of policy. Her tone was tight, her smile thinner than printer paper. Then came the twist. The treasurer, a mild-mannered woman named Ruth, cleared her throat. We've reviewed Mr. Jenkins's documentation, she said, and technically under our own bylaws, his property does qualify as part of the community aesthetic. Therefore, the damage is classified as community property impact. A collective murmur swept the room. Someone whispered, "He got her." Another stifled a laugh. Karen's cheeks flushed. "That's ridiculous. He's twisting the rules for personal gain." Ruth replied evenly, "He followed them more closely than any of us have, Karen." The room chuckled. Karen slammed her folder shut. "This is harassment." Earl raised a hand, still smiling. "Ma'am, harassment's a strong word. I just filed paperwork." The laughter broke free then, loud and unstoppable. Even Dennis laughed nervously. Karen's composure cracked. She gathered her things and announced, "Meeting adjourned," before storming out. Tom leaned over and whispered, "You just broke the HOA sound barrier." But the story didn't end there. It only rippled wider. By morning, screenshots of the meeting minutes hit the neighborhood Facebook group. Someone started a meme page called Harvest Ridge Tractor Watch. The picture of Karen pointing at the board went viral locally with captions like "She came," "She saw," "She filed a complaint." Earl didn't post a thing. He didn't need to. The internet was doing what the wheat field always had, growing wild. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one printed on legal letterhead. It was a cease and desist notice from the HOA attorney, demanding that Earl withdraw his claim immediately or face civil escalation. He read it twice, then pinned it right next to the fine notice on his corkboard, just beneath his Army service medal. "Quite the collection," he said aloud. That evening, Tom dropped by again. "You gonna answer that letter?" Earl grinned. "Already did. Sent him a copy of their own bylaws with highlights. Color-coded? Of course." For a few days, things quieted. Then Friday morning brought a new development. A knock on the door followed by the familiar sound of Deputy Hank's boots on the porch. "Hank," Earl greeted, pouring him coffee. "What brings law enforcement to my side of paradise?" Hank smirked. "You're trending, old man. HOA called us again. Said there's been property defacement." Earl frowned. "Defacement?" Hank gestured toward the yard. Someone had stuck a small wooden sign next to the tractor reading, "Karen's contribution. Sponsored by the HOA." Earl chuckled so hard his coffee nearly spilled. "Any idea who did it?" Hank asked, grinning. "Nope," Earl said, still laughing. But they've got a sense of humor I admire. Well, keep it, Hank said, turning to leave. We don't take cases involving poetic justice. By Saturday, the HOA meltdown was in full swing. Karen called for another emergency meeting, this one via Zoom. Earl didn't attend, but Tom did, claiming he wanted to see history unfold. Later, he came over with a play-by-play. Karen tried to argue you violated the HOA's social media policy by inspiring memes, Tom said, barely containing laughter. Ruth told her that's not a real rule. Then someone uploaded a picture of the tractor with sunglasses on it. Earl shook his head, smiling. Internet moves faster than wheat grows. Still, beneath the humor, tension hummed. Late Sunday night, Earl's mailbox rattled again. Another letter, this time thicker, stamped with the HOA seal. He opened it carefully. Inside was a formal acknowledgement from the insurance company. We have approved payment for community property restoration. Total amount $2,742. Pending HOA fund transfer authorization. At the bottom was a line for HOA president approval. And there it was, Karen's signature in blue ink. Earl laughed so loud the cat bolted from the room. He read it again just to be sure. The irony was delicious. In her rush to handle paperwork before the meeting, Karen had apparently pre-signed the form. Bureaucratic autopilot had done what revenge never could. He framed the letter right next to the cease and desist. Now that, he said to himself, is symmetry. The next day, however, the fallout began. Karen marched across the cul-de-sac, face red as rust, waving her phone. You manipulated the board, she shouted. Ma'am, Earl said calmly. You signed the document yourself. I didn't read it. He raised an eyebrow. That's not my fault. You tell folks to read the rules all the time. She sputtered, pointed a trembling finger, then turned away, muttering something about legal counsel. By evening, the gossip mill hit overdrive. Half the neighborhood sided with Earl. The other half simply enjoyed the show. The HOA's inbox crashed from too many emails. One subject line leaked online. Tractor insurance reimbursement, urgent damage control. That night, as Earl sat on his porch watching the sunset, the sound of crickets returned. Felt like calm after a storm. But he knew one more gust was coming, the kind that leaves everything clearer afterward. He leaned back, the porch boards creaking under his boots. At this point, he said softly, breaking his rule about talking to himself, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. Then, almost as if the universe wanted perfect timing, his phone pinged. A new email notification. Subject line, Final review, property adjustment approved. He opened it slowly, savoring the moment. The HOA treasurer had confirmed the payment had been processed. He set the phone down and chuckled. Well, they just bought me a new fender. But the quiet didn't last long. Around 9 that night, headlights swept across his driveway. Karen's SUV again, creeping like a cat. She stopped in front of his property, rolled down her window, and snapped another picture. Then she peeled off, tires crunching the gravel hard enough to throw sparks. Earl just smiled and tipped his coffee toward the retreating taillights. Drive safe, Madam President. He stood for a long while afterward, listening to the night. The wheat swayed gently, the tractor stood dignified, and somewhere in the distance, laughter drifted through the open windows of Tom's house. Inside, on the corkboard, the framed letter gleamed under the kitchen light, a quiet monument to patience and paperwork. Then, just as he turned to head inside, another envelope slid under his door, thin and crisp. No return address. He bent down and picked it up. It wasn't from Karen this time. It was from the HOA insurance office, marked reimbursement confirmation. He smiled. Another letter, he said softly, echoing the first time. But this one's worth reading. And with that, the wheel of neighborhood justice turned one last time, slow, steady, and beautifully ironic. The following morning arrived soft and golden. The kind of morning that made Earl forget for a minute there'd ever been drama in Harvest Ridge. Birds chattered in the trees, dew glistened on the wheat, and the smell of wet soil drifted in through the open kitchen window. He stood at the counter stirring his coffee, looking out at the tractor like a proud father. The dented fender was still there, though soon it wouldn't be, because sitting right beside his coffee mug was a check, $2,742, made out to Harvest Ridge HOA, payable to property claimant, Earl L. Jenkins. He smiled as he turned it over in his hands. After months of absurdity, someone, somewhere in the great labyrinth of paperwork, had decided he was right. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was the signature at the bottom, the neat corporate scrawl that said approved by HOA Claims Department. Bureaucracy had just paid for its own hypocrisy. When Tom came by later, Earl held the check up like a trophy. Look what sprouted from all that nonsense. Tom let out a low whistle. They actually paid you? Insurance company did. HOA had to authorize it, though. And she signed it? Earl nodded, savoring the words. She signed it. Tom leaned back in his chair, grinning. You gonna frame that or cash it? Both, Earl said. Frame the receipt. By noon, the news had spread. The HOA email chain erupted like popcorn in a skillet. Half the neighbors were thrilled, half confused, and a few simply stunned. One subject line leaked to the Facebook group. Urgent, unauthorized disbursement requires review. But it was too late. The funds were already in motion. The HOA's own policy had validated the claim. That evening, Earl called a local welder, a young guy named Mike who ran a small workshop outside town. You fix tractor fenders? Sure do. Bring her in or I can swing by. Swing by. I'll pay in cash. When Mike arrived the next day, he whistled at the damage. She got you good, huh? Karen did her best, Earl said dryly. Mike grinned. You mean the Karen? My grandma's been talking about that story all week. You're a legend at the diner. Earl chuckled. Small towns don't need TV when you've got an HOA. While Mike worked, Earl raked the edge of his wheat patch, trimming away the dry stalks. He decided to repurpose part of the insurance payout for something else too. A small green-roofed shed beside the oak tree. Nothing flashy, just a tidy home for the tractor. Landscaping improvement, he called it. When the treasurer, Ruth, came by later to inspect, she raised an eyebrow. Is that what you're building with the reimbursement funds? Exactly that, Earl said. You folks wanted better community aesthetics. I'm contributing. Ruth laughed, shaking her head. You know, the funny part is you're still within the rules. That's my favorite part, he replied. The construction took 3 days. Neighbors wandered by with thin excuses to look. Walking dogs that didn't need walking, delivering cookies no one had ordered. Tom supervised from a lawn chair, calling it quality control. Even the sheriff stopped once, leaning on his cruiser door. Heard you're upgrading, Hank said, smirking. Gotta keep the standards up, Earl said. By the 4th day, the shed stood complete. Pine siding, steel roof, perfectly level door. Earl painted it the same deep green as the tractor and installed a small brass nameplate near the entrance that read, Karen's contribution. The lettering gleamed in the sunlight. Tom nearly fell off his chair laughing when he saw it. You actually did it, Earl shrugged. Seemed fitting. The next HOA meeting came a week later. Earl didn't plan to attend, but curiosity got the better of him. He found a seat in the back, coffee in hand, while Karen sat at the head table with a face that looked carved from stone. The treasurer began with announcements about landscaping updates, then cleared her throat. Next order of business, reimbursement oversight. Karen's voice was clipped. We have experienced an unfortunate misinterpretation of policy, resulting in a disbursement of HOA funds to a private individual. Ruth interjected. Correction. To a member of the community, for community visible property. A low ripple of chuckles passed through the room. Karen pressed on. Regardless, this has created a precedent that could encourage people to read the bylaws, someone said from the back. Karen's jaw tightened. Create confusion. Earl raised a hand. If it helps, I used the funds for property improvement. Got a new shed. Matches the community aesthetic and everything. Someone whispered, "That's the one with the plaque." Another laughed outright. Karen slammed her gavel. Order. But there was no order left to keep. The HOA's authority had cracked. Ruth proposed a motion to revise bylaws for clarity. Someone else proposed a vote to elect a new president. The motion passed almost immediately. Karen stared straight ahead, lips pressed so tight they went white. When the meeting ended, she gathered her papers without a word and walked out, leaving her gavel behind. Earl picked it up, looked at Ruth. "Guess she won't be needing this." Ruth smiled. "You can keep it. Souvenir." He brought it home and hung it right above the tractor shed's door. Beneath it, the brass plaque caught the sunset. That evening, as the sky burned orange and the air smelled like dust and fresh-cut pine, Earl stood in front of his finished shed. The new fender gleamed, perfect again. The tractor sat tucked inside, safe, dignified. He took a deep breath, felt the slow satisfaction of poetic justice settling into his bones. Tom joined him, beer in hand. "You realize you just outlawyered an entire board of people with a highlighter and a sense of humor." Earl chuckled. "Didn't need a lawyer. Just patience." "Think she'll ever speak to you again?" "Maybe," Earl said, smiling. "She'll wave with the usual number of fingers." They both laughed, and for a while they just stood there, listening to the quiet. The wheat swayed, the cicadas buzzed, and somewhere down the road, a mower hummed. The neighborhood was finally calm again. When he went inside, he noticed the corkboard above his desk, the collection of letters and notices from the past months. He took each one down, stacked them neatly, and tied them with twine. Then he wrote on the top sheet, "The Great Tractor Affair." He figured someday, when the next homeowner got a ridiculous fine, he'd hand it to them and say, "Here's your blueprint." Before bed, Earl stepped out one last time. The moonlight silvered the roof of his new shed. A frog croaked by the lake, and the night air was cool against his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt nothing but peace. He spoke softly to the tractor, as if it could hear him. "Well, girl, we made it. They wrote the rules, we just followed them better." He gave the fender a gentle pat. It shone like polished armor. The irony of it all still made him chuckle. The same HOA that fined him for disrupting community harmony had ended up funding his improvement project. Karen's war on visibility had built him a monument visible from half the street. As he turned to go inside, he looked back once more at the brass plaque glinting under the porch light. Karen's contribution. The words caught the breeze, half hidden by the whispering wheat. Earl smiled and said to no one in particular, "Never underestimate a man with time, a tractor, and access to bylaws." Inside, the clock ticked steady, the house creaked softly, and the porch light flickered out on its own, like the neighborhood itself exhaling after a long, ridiculous season. Somewhere across the street, blinds twitched. He could almost feel her watching. But this time she didn't shout, didn't call the cops, didn't write a letter. She just stood there, silent, defeated, maybe finally realizing that all her power came from the very rules she didn't bother to understand. Earl took one last sip of coffee, leaned against the window frame, and whispered to the quiet night, "I finally mowed the lawn," smiling this time. And with that, Harvest Ridge settled back into the kind of peace only earned after good, clean revenge wrapped in paperwork. Summer mellowed into September, and the air in Harvest Ridge changed. The heat softened, the crickets got louder, and people started talking about fall festivals instead of fines. For the first time in months, Earl Jenkins could walk out his front door without spotting a clipboard, a notice, or a nervous neighbor trying not to make eye contact. Life, as it does after any good storm, had settled. Each morning, Earl still started the day the same way. Coffee steaming in one hand, the other resting on the porch railing, watching the sunrise gild the wheat. The tractor sat inside its new green-roofed shed, shining like a medal of honor. Sometimes he still couldn't believe how everything had unfolded, how patience and paperwork had done more damage than yelling ever could. He liked the calm, the quiet. Even the lake seemed friendlier now, glass smooth and catching the reflection of that brass plaque that still read Karen's contribution. Neighbors still walked by, slowing down a little to smile or wave. The jokes had softened too, less mocking, more knowing. They'd all seen something rare. A man who beat the HOA without losing his temper or his dignity. Tom came by most mornings now, bringing donuts instead of gossip. "You ever gonna take that sign down?" he asked one Saturday, biting into a maple bar. Earl grinned. "Wouldn't be neighborly. It's community property now." Tom laughed so hard he nearly choked. "You're the reason they're rewriting the bylaws again." "I know," Earl said, taking a sip of coffee. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Truth was, the new HOA president, Ruth, the treasurer who'd quietly backed him through the chaos, had handled the transition gracefully. She'd cut the fines, ditched the photo patrols, and added one small but meaningful rule to the handbook. No enforcement action shall be taken without unanimous board agreement. It was the closest thing to peace the neighborhood had seen in years. Karen, on the other hand, had retreated into a quiet sort of exile. She still jogged past Earl's property most mornings, her pace brisk, eyes forward, pretending not to notice him. The first few times, she couldn't resist muttering something under her breath, but eventually, even that stopped. It seemed she'd learned what everyone else eventually did. You can't out-argue someone who knows the rules better than you do. One Sunday afternoon, Earl found himself at the local farmer's market. He wasn't selling anything, just browsing, picking up honey and a few jars of homemade jam. People recognized him, the tractor guy. They wanted to shake his hand, tell him their own HOA horror stories. One man even said, "You're the reason I'm keeping every receipt this year." Earl laughed, embarrassed but amused. "Glad to be of service," he said, tipping his hat. "But remember, stay polite. Paper cuts last longer than arguments." That line caught on. By the following week, it was quoted on the neighborhood Facebook page. Someone even made a meme of his tractor with the caption, "Politeness wins wars." He didn't mind. The attention didn't bother him because it came from shared experience. Everyone had dealt with some version of a Karen in their life, someone convinced control equals community. Earl's story gave them hope that reason and humor could still win. One evening, the HOA hosted its first community potluck in years. Ruth's idea, naturally. The long tables were set up near the clubhouse, string lights glowing overhead, kids running around barefoot while the adults compared casseroles. Earl showed up late, bringing a batch of cornbread and a jug of sweet tea. The conversations were easy now, laughter genuine. A few neighbors even apologized for staying quiet during the whole fiasco. "We didn't know how to help," one said sheepishly. Earl waved it off. "You don't have to fight every battle," he said. "Just don't believe every headline in a newsletter." Halfway through the evening, Ruth clinked her glass for attention. "Before we eat," she said, "I'd like to thank Mr. Jenkins here for reminding us what community really means. Patience, humor, and knowing when to stand your ground." The crowd chuckled and clapped. Earl raised his glass and said, "Appreciate it, but I just wanted to park my tractor." That earned a bigger laugh, the good kind, the kind that washed away the last bits of tension that had lingered since spring. Later that night, as the party wound down, Karen arrived. She didn't come to eat, just hovered near the entrance, hands clasped, eyes darting. When she finally walked over, a hush fell. Earl saw her coming, saw that pride still lived in her posture, but something else too, weariness. "Evening, Karen," he said kindly. She hesitated, then nodded. "Earl." Her voice was lower than usual, stripped of that sharpness. "I wanted to say, maybe things got out of hand." He smiled gently. "They did, but no harm done." "Well," he gestured toward the tractor shed. "Mostly." A few people laughed, and even she cracked a reluctant smile. "That sign," she said, shaking her head. "You just had to." "Historical accuracy," he said. They stood there for a moment, awkward but human, and finally she said, "I suppose you made your point." "Didn't mean to make one," he replied softly. "Just wanted to live here without a war." She nodded again, and for the first time in months, they shook hands. Not friends, maybe, but no longer enemies either. When he got home that night, the moon hung low and wide over the wheat field. The lights from the potluck twinkled faintly across the lake. The tractor shed glowed under the porch light, its roof glinting faintly. He thought about how funny life could be, how the smallest, pettiest problem could grow into something that changed the whole rhythm of a neighborhood. He sat on his porch and reflected on it all. People liked to say the world was getting worse, that neighbors didn't talk anymore, that civility was gone. But Earl didn't buy it. He'd seen how even in a petty little war over a tractor, folks could still find their way back to decency. Through laughter, a little paperwork, and a reminder that control doesn't equal respect. He looked out at the wheat swaying under the stars and whispered, "Good fences make great punchlines." The night air was cool, the crickets loud. He could hear the faint chime of wind bells from someone's porch down the road. It was peaceful again, earned peace, not borrowed. A week later, the local newspaper ran a small story titled "Retired Veteran Wins Unusual HOA Case with Humor and Patience." The article ended with a quote from Earl. "They wanted harmony. I just wanted common sense." He clipped it out and pinned it beside the brass nameplate inside his shed. Not out of pride, but as a reminder of what happens when calm people stand their ground. As fall deepened, the wheat turned amber again. Life rolled back into its rhythms. The HOA now sent out newsletters about block parties instead of warnings. The community page featured bake sales, lost pets, and the occasional photo of Earl's tractor, always captioned with a wink. Sometimes, when a new neighbor moved in, Tom would tell them the story. "See that shed?" he'd say, pointing. "That's Karen's contribution." Long story short, don't mess with a man who reads fine print. Earl never corrected him. He'd just smile from his porch, pretending not to hear. He didn't need the last word. He already had it written in steel, pine, and irony. And once in a while, on a slow evening, he'd start that old tractor just to hear it hum. Not because he needed to plow, but because the sound reminded him that patience has its own kind of power. The engine's steady rhythm echoed across the lake, through the cul-de-sac, a gentle reminder that peace wasn't about silence. It was about knowing when you'd already won. He leaned back, content. "So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine," he murmured, eyes closing with a grin, "remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it." And with that, the night settled, the wheat whispered, and the man who turned paperwork into poetry drifted off in the soft hum of a tractor's ghost, finally at peace in his absurdly perfect neighborhood.